no regrets, no confusion. There'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways.
Happy Pride Month once again, and welcome back to the Leaving Eden podcast. My name is Gavriel Hakohen. I'm here with my BFF and co-host, cult expert, cult survivor, Sadie Carpenter. How are you doing today?
Doing fantastic. Happy Pride Month. And also, if you're listening to this on release day, happy Juneteenth.
Yes, happy Juneteenth. You know, I actually went to Pride for the first time this year, and I really enjoyed myself. Yeah, I went to Pride. There's a neighborhood in Center City in Philadelphia called the Gayborhood, which is where like a lot of the historically gay bars and gay culture is in the city of Philadelphia. And it's just really a couple blocks from where I live. So I went down there, and I have a friend who is a bartender at a gay sports bar there. And so I went there and sang karaoke. It was a lot of fun.
What did you sing?
I sang Beyonce. Of course, I sang Beyonce.
Very appropriate choice, yeah.
Yes, I love celebrating Pride, and I love celebrating Pride with you, all the wonderful people from the Leaving Eden podcast, and thank you guys so much. Sadie, do you want to talk about what we're talking about today?
Yes, so today's interview is with Meghan Crozier. You may know her from the Thereafter podcast, Thereafter pod. We are talking about the experience of realizing your queerness a little bit later in life, like in a person's 30s or 40s, as opposed to when a lot of people do when they're teenagers or 20s, or even younger than that. We also talk about heteronormativity and evangelical culture. I think we had a really great conversation, and I'm excited to share it with our listeners.
It is really exciting. It was fantastic I did more listening than talking on that one because it's not really my experience. We're really excited to share this conversation with you.
You learned stuff, Gavi.
I learned a lot of stuff, and you'll get to hear exactly what I learned, and hopefully you'll learn something too. Before we get into that, the Leaving Eden podcast is the podcast about my BFF and co-host Sadie Carpenter's life in and escape from the independent fundamental Baptist cult. We talk about this cult. We talk about other cults. We talk about religion. We talk about fundamentalism. We talk about the real and present threat that cults and cult ideologies pose to society as a whole. And it is our goal to promote freedom of mind, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. So if you like our show, if you're a fan of our show, there's a few things that you can do to support us. You can join our Patreon, where there's an extended and uncensored version of most of our episodes, also ad-free. You can join our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/Eden Exodus. You can join our subreddit, which is reddit.com/r/Eden Exodus. If you've seen the Duggars documentary, Shiny Happy People, or if you're interested in the Duggars, we just about a week and a half ago, we came out with a special review of that episode, and we had some of the actual contributors from that episode. Chad Harris and Lindsay Williams, they were both on the documentary. Chad Harris, you may know him as Arch Radish. Lindsay Williams, you know her on TikTok and Instagram as Cult Chronicles. Is it one of them is The Cult Chronicles? The other one is Cult Chronicles.
Well, I know that TikTok is Cult Chronicles.
Okay, then Instagram is The Cult Chronicles. And you know Chad Harris as Arch Radish. He's very big on TikTok. Both of these people featured very prominently in the IBLP documentary and the Duggars documentary, Shiny Happy People. And both of them came on together on our show. And you can listen to that episode. That's on our feed. Make sure that you go and check that out if you haven't checked it out yet. Yeah, I'm going to thank our patrons. Sadie's going to give us the TW, and I'm going to read a Pride story from a listener, and then we're going to get into our episode. So, Faith Promise Missions, and I gave it all to your patrons. Thank you guys so much. I gave it all to your patrons. Your names are Kathleen Moncrief, Melissa Mosley. Fantastic. Wonderful. We do appreciate you so much. Our Faith Promise Missions to your patrons are Alex P., Alicia Guild, Ali Allen, Anisha Patel, Ashley Doxtater, Brooke Tully, Chrissa, Crystal Patterson, Dear Ethan Hansen, the musical, Dora J., Eleanor Donahue, Enchanted Fairy, Esther M., Hannah Ross, Hope Norum, Horton Here's a Shane, Janine Collin, Jen Kaharski, Jessica Tambo, Jonna, Kat Henwood, Kay Turwee, Kristen Marie, Linda Morgan, Lindsay Goss, Lorena Watson, Madeline Cusick, Marlena Stuve, Marcia Millard. Marcia Millard is new. That's not a name I've seen before. Yeah, welcome, Marcia. Mary Williams, Mary Martin, Megan Arendt, Rob the Methodist, Sarah Reese, Scooby Sleuth, Stephanie Johnson, Susie, Tara McNamara, Tiffany Enderby, and Wes the Cowboy. Thank you guys so much for being Faith Promise Missions to your patrons, and I Gave It All to your patrons. And thank you so much to everyone who supports us over on Patreon.
Yes, a big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters, as well as our listeners who aren't able to financially support on Patreon right now, but support us in other ways, like sharing our podcast with friends and family, talking about us on social media, and all the other ways that you send new listeners our way.
Yes, thank you guys so much. Sadie, just give us the TW, and then I'm going to read a pride story, and then we'll get right to this interview.
All right. In general, we talk about a lot of potentially triggering topics on this show, including but not limited to suicide and mental health, racism, misogyny, PTSD symptoms, child abuse, mental, physical, and sexual abuse, and spiritual abuse, including guilt, shame, and fear. In most episodes, we'll mention at least a few of these topics, but we try very hard to avoid graphic detail unless it's relevant to the story that we're telling on that day. And we give you a heads up before we go into any of that kind of detail for any reason. This episode in particular does talk about heteronormativity and comp het and sexuality and bisexuality, but this is a light on the triggers and maybe a little deeper on the theory. We, of course, talk about queer people being invalidated in church and affirming theology, and even moving past affirming theology into being an affirming person. But I don't think this episode is too heavy on any triggers beyond that.
I like to have less triggering episodes, especially since we started off the month with Westboro Baptist.
Trying to hit a good balance.
Yeah, trying to hit a good balance. And of course, next week we have the Leaving Eden drag brunch to close out Pride Month, which is one of my favorite traditions. But another of my favorite traditions is when we get to read Pride stories from the listeners. So I have one from M. M uses they, them pronouns. Thank you, M, so much for writing into us. I'm going to read this story. It says, the actual story I want to tell is mostly humorous, if a little bit toxic in nature, but that's what you get with IFB kids. However, before I do the main story, I wanted to give a little background. For context purposes, I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and our parents were missionaries to Belgium and Holland while I was growing up. And then later, my dad started his own little church way out in the boonies of Alabama. Roll Tide. Where there were as many meth labs as churches, but only the meth labs blew up usually. ... Usually. There's a story there, and I don't know. Our parents were/are very conservative and big into IFB. My dad actually went to Hyles-Anderson College when it first opened, but left a little early due to Hyles being a power-hungry weirdo, and because my dad was so convinced that Jesus was coming back any second that he had to get out of there and start preaching the gospel as quickly as possible. Like really desperate hype man on a really tiny budget. That's a combination of good and bad, I'd say. I think really reading Hyles as a power-hungry weirdo is a plus, but you know,
everybody has their wins and losses in life.
Yeah, well, M goes on to say, still waiting for that comeback, JC. Just kidding, I'm an atheist now. Anyways, being so conservative was both just all I knew and therefore natural, and at the same time so frustrating and stifling. I'm an AFAB person, and by now you well know that what kind of limitations and expectations are put on us in the IFB. I knew from around the time I was 6 or 7 that I never wanted to have kids, but everyone around me kept making comments about when you're a mother, as if it was an unavoidable reality before I'd even hit puberty. Ugh, yuck, that's kind of grooming behavior. My mom was/is the biggest proponent of these comments. Fairly recently, she even broke into tears on a phone call, calling it, quote, unnatural that I still don't want to have kids. She needs better hobbies.
Indeed.
Yeah. But we really started butting heads when, in my late teens, I realized that I'm non-binary, not out to her to this day. Oof, that sucks. And I finally started dressing more how I wanted to dress. This included getting a short haircut, wearing pants. That's a whole nother story about how Hobby Lobby was ironically a gateway drug into me wearing pants. Man, ugh.
Hell of a way to start.
Yeah, Hobby Lobby. They're getting young queer people to wear pants and funding ISIS. So, like, and also started my ongoing collection of flannel shirts. Hell yeah. I also bought my own underwear. Let me tell you, men's boxer briefs are so comfy. Unfortunately, my mom found the packaging for the underwear and told me that was cross-dressing and that I needed to get rid of them or God would punish me, etc. So I had to throw them away. Don't worry, I just got better at hiding my forbidden comfy underwear contraband.
How dare they want to be comfortable all of the time?
Yeah.
Don't you know that God's plan for AFAB people is to always be pinched, squeezed, and itchy?
Sounds about right.
In my experience from the IFB.
Flash forward to about 3 years ago. By this point, I had moved out of the state and all the way across the country. I had lived in the woods for a period of time doing conservation work and managed not to get eaten by bears or trampled by moose, and had also managed not to die of heat stroke or freeze to death on a mountain. Good for you. I had also acquired a partner. Just like the wording. Somehow, neither parent was terribly thrilled about it as we had started living together, or I'm sorry, TW for the phrase, we were living in sin. Gasp.
Oh no.
But there wasn't much they could do about it, besides lecture me that I would wind up barefoot and pregnant. But I thought pregnant was a good thing.
Yeah. So their mom was upset because they didn't want to have a child, and then their mom threatened them with the potential of having a child as if it were a bad thing.
Fundamentalism, baby. Let's
go. Not very
go.
Consistent.
But back then, that wasn't going to stop my mom from taking me to Dirt Cheap, damn it. If you don't know, I don't know what is this. Sadie, what's Dirt Cheap, damn it?
It's a store in the South. It's like
Is it like Dollar General?
No, it's more like Kmart. It's like a step below Kmart.
Okay, so it's just like a budget store.
Yeah.
Okay. However, I had grown too complacent in my own independence and ability to buy whatever clothing I wanted or liked. While walking past one of the many bargain bins, I spotted a cheap pack of men's boxer briefs, and without thinking, I picked them up and put them in the basket. Mom looked at them and looked at me and said, "Does Darren need new underwear?" That's BTW. That's like not a real name. That's a fake name, obviously. And like a brash idiot, I looked her dead in the eye and said, "No, it's for me." There was a long pause, and then she looks at the underwear again, looks back at me and says, "Well, that's not very sexy. Doesn't Darren mind?"
Oh, yikes.
Yeah, I nearly fainted in shock. My mother, who has never talked about sex openly or even said sexy ever in her life, as far as I know, who yelled at me for half an hour when she found out I knew what a hickey was, who made me wear culottes for 17 years, has the audacity to tell me that my underwear choices aren't sexy enough for a man she has never met and doesn't even like on principle. What a legend. The mental gymnastics her brain must have gone through to get there. I'm surprised it didn't give her a nosebleed. That's it. That's the story. It's a bit long-winded, but I can't help it. I'm a chronic detailer who doesn't need detail quite that much, but does it anyway. At any rate,
that's how I got a podcast.
Yes. It was an enjoyable read. At any rate, thanks for reading. I hope at least it gave you a bit of a chuckle and maybe even a chortle if I'm lucky. Well, it gave a little bit of a chortle and a little bit of a chuckle. Thank you so much, Em, for writing into us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was a brilliant takedown of the ideological inconsistencies of fundamentalism, because it's like because of your assigned gender at birth, you must bear children. Like, you are a person in possession of a uterus, and therefore you must use it. And then they do things that their parents don't like, and then the mother says, well, you're going to have to use that uterus, as if that would like be a bad thing, even though their mother spent most of their life trying to pressure them into bearing a child.
Yes.
And then you're a bad person because you're living with a person who you are not married to and presumably participating in sexual activity with them. And that makes you bad, but don't you dare buy underwear that I assume doesn't turn that person on.
It's just like 8 layers of
like a 7-layer salad.
I was thinking 7-layer dip, but
Like,
I guess 7-layer salad is
salad
more
of ideological inconsistency.
Yeah, 7-layer salad is more funny. Thank you so much, Em, for for writing to us. We're going to go right to this interview with Meghan. Thank you guys so much. This is a really a great listen. We hope you guys enjoy it.
We are here with Meghan Crozier, one of the hosts of the Thereafter podcast, and somebody that I really enjoy following on social media. I feel like I have a lot in common with. And we're here to talk about her experience of bisexuality in the church and my experience, kind of compare notes and have a chat. Welcome, Meghan. We're so happy to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So your podcast is about your story, your past in evangelicalism. Can you start by giving us your background? Tell us your life story, whatever you'd like to share with our listeners.
Yeah, and our podcast, I feel like, goes into a lot of different stories. So just to put that out there, but yeah, I grew up evangelical and grew up in the Midwest in a non-denominational-ish church, and I say that because we were part of the Evangelical Free Church, but we were really based. I was in Illinois. We were based off of Willow Creek Community Church and kind of their like quote unquote seeker-friendly model with like drama and all of that. And so I was all in. And so I was a student leader in my youth group. I went to public school through high school, but then I went to a Christian college. And out of all of the Christian colleges, because I went in Chicago, it was a more, I guess, liberal one compared to, I guess, Wheaton or Moody. But I went there because I liked that environment at the time for me. And I knew all the rules. I loved rules. They felt like comfort for me because it was like, just tell me what to do and I'll do them. And it was easy until it wasn't, it was kind of that thing. And so I did that for a really long time. I almost became a missionary after college. I studied Spanish and youth ministry in college. And for a lot of reasons, that's a different story. That didn't work out. And I went back to school and got a teaching degree. And then I was a teacher for 15 years. And so kind of during the pandemic, I started deconstructing everything, my career, my faith, my sexuality, just all kinds of things. And so, and I think loosely over time, I had always had a little bit of the, I guess I could say, Rachel Held Evans kind of tone in my head, in my brain, that would be like, wait a second. And I would have those moments, but then I didn't follow those kind of thoughts or lines of thinking for a while until I did. And then once I did, I was kind of horrified. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell.
It's like getting on a roller coaster. And you get up to the top of that big first hill, and then you start going down and you think, oh my God, what did I get myself into?
Yeah.
I definitely identify with that. I also went to Christian college in the Chicago area, believe it or not. But I went to the really weird fundamentalist one over in Crown Point, Indiana. So I know that, what was your background growing up in church and being in Christian college? in regards to LGBTQ people? Were they affirming? Were they not affirming, kind of a middle ground? What was your experience? What were you being taught?
Well, so I have a story of a really good friend that I had in high school that was gay, and I brought him to youth group, and he was like, he knew he was gay. That wasn't a question. And so his first kind of charge was to go up to our youth pastor and say, what does the church think about this? And the immediate response was, the whole love the sinner, hate the sin. And I think it was
Oh,
so wild
yikes.
to me because at the time I just did not see the damage that mentality has. And we don't have to unpack that now, but at the time I was like, oh, okay. I see that, and so that's kind of what I had, the message that I had for a very long time until I saw, it more, in the last 5-10 years have dug in, but that was kind of what I grew up with.
And that seems, I grew up in a less affirming, like on the far other end of that love the sinner, hate the sin spectrum. The people who say that with their mouth, but in reality very much do not practice the love the sinner part.
Yeah.
That sounds so nice. Like when you are fully immersed in that belief system, like you think that that's as good as you can possibly do. And it's difficult when you have that realization of, oh, this is not as good as I can do, and also this is not acceptable or good enough.
Were you taught that gay people go to hell?
I was taught that our ultimate goal was to save them. And I'm trying to think if that message, I don't think that message was explicit, but I was taught that it was a kind of a wrong that needed righting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you can get into all of these layers in evangelicalism where it's, oh no, gay people can absolutely get saved and go to heaven, but if they're really saved, isn't God gonna do a work in their heart to reduce the feelings of attraction that they have to people of the same gender, or to change who they are, or to magically make them straight, and towards the more extreme end of that. I know that coming out as bi was a pretty recent development for you. Was that in the last, like, maybe year or so?
Yeah, it was last August. I made a public post. It was right around the time of my 40th birthday, and that had been kind of a big year for me. I had learned a lot of things about myself, and it was just, I tweeted it out. It was something that I had a couple conversations with. Well, I had a few friends that I had a lot of conversations with about it. Yeah, I put it out on social media, and that was really, I was probably more publicly out than I did that more, I guess, in a public way than having, several ongoing private conversations.
I found you on Twitter like right around that same time.
Yeah.
So it was oh, this new Twitter follow that I don't feel like I know yet through the internet, and was seeing you doing a public coming out post, and that was really inspiring to me because I really love to see people giving themselves that affirmation at any point in their life. So that was a fun time to find you on Twitter, and then I started listening to your podcast and kind of got to know you a little bit better. So the coming out was pretty recent. When did you first come to realize that you were not straight?
I would say it was kind of a process, but it was more recent than it was ongoing for years, so it was probably in the last year. And also specifically to that post, I will just say that I was very overwhelmed by the support that I got from the queer community, because I think I had a little bit of, I guess, bi imposter syndrome, just, and I think that I was kind of processing and understanding, and I was like, no, this is who I am. And just seeing how fiercely people were like, especially queer folks, were like, welcome, you're one of us. We see you and we understand you. And that was a very, very big deal to me. And because I just wanted to also honor folks that had I didn't have this experience where I was closeted for years and had that affect my mental health the way that it does to folks that are closeted and just know fiercely for many, many years. And so I wanted to honor that, like, my experience is different than other folks, and that there's privilege in the way that I was able to come out, and then also being in, a straight passing marriage at the time, and just and in, the grand scheme of how folks face marginalization and things like that, and just knowing kind of where I'm at. And so that was part of that whole journey. But as far as the kind of understanding my own self and my own journey, it was something that I started to see a spark of in just as I was fiercely, I guess, an ally for the queer community, for the lack of a better way of saying it, or an advocate, and just really starting to deeply understand, like, this is what this looks like, and this is how people are treated in evangelicalism and things like that. And I really started to see myself in that, and I started to see, and I think too, I'm going to be honest, as queer representation becomes more and more visible in media and in conversations, and you start to hear yourself in other people's stories and see yourself portrayed, you're like, oh, I resonate with that way more fiercely than I ever realized. And so it was just a process, and then having conversations where I had more to understand about bisexuality than I knew, and about queerness than I had known. And so talking to my queer friends and reading books by queer authors and things like that were all part of that process.
You hit on in that statement so many things that I want to talk about with you. So that was fantastic.
I swear, every time we have like a guest on, and Sadie's like, I really want to talk to this person, they always tell a story like that, and I'm just like, where have I heard this story before?
Oh yeah, co-host.
Yeah.
Last week we had Pastor Noah Hepler. If you watch Queer Eye, he was the ECLA pastor.
Oh,
on
that's
the first episode of
yeah.
season 5 in Philly.
Yep, I did see
Oh my
that
God,
episode.
he was amazing. He and I are best friends now.
Yes.
Like, big scripture nerd. Like, we had the best time.
But like everything that he said, I was just like, where have I heard this before?
Yes. Yep.
It is really interesting to specifically be a bisexual person. And that's why I wanted to have you on this episode, because I felt like you and I could have this conversation, because there is inherent privilege for bi people who are in straight passing relationships, and for bi people who don't present extremely queer, which is hard to do in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
Because I have bright purple hair, multiple tattoos, and generally wear like jeans, a band shirt, and a flannel, and people think I'm a straight girl.
Yeah.
Because we live in Portland.
That. Yep.
My experience is that since I moved from Portland to Philadelphia, in Portland, the way that I look and the way that I dress is 100% straight, and I get to Philadelphia and like people keep asking me if I'm bisexual. It's
because you have a nose ring and a couple earrings.
Oh, that's funny.
In Portland, that's like the signaling. There's no signaling. It doesn't make any sense.
So I want to circle back around to that, like, compet and the interesting place that bisexual people occupy, like, in society and in the LGBTQ universe, because of, like, there's like a hand-in-hand privilege and also erasure, and they go, it's both the same thing. I want to back up into your story for just a second first, if that's okay, because
Sure.
I feel like there were signs of, oh yeah, this kid is absolutely bi, all the way back to childhood. I did not have any access to language about, like, what that bisexuality existed. So my story is kind of, I grew up, I knew I was attracted to boys. So I never thought to ask myself if I was attracted to girls, because I'm attracted to boys. Therefore, I'm straight and not a sinner, and we're okay. But now, like, with my perspective, there were signs. Do you feel like, what's your story regarding that? Do you feel like you might have realized you're bisexual sooner if you had more access to language or information?
Oh, 1,000%. I think that, our society is so heteronormative, and it's just that's the water that we swim in, and it's outside of even evangelicalism, I think just society as a whole. And so I think back, and I've had other people that come out as bi, and they'll say things like, oh, that friendship that I had with that childhood friend was like a crush. And I don't have those moments, right? But I do have moments where, and I do think that if I had given myself permission to have attraction to anyone, there would have been attraction there a lot sooner. But I do have these moments where I'll be telling a story to someone, and they'll be like, Meg, that's like you realizing that you were bi, or like I'll be like, wait,
That's a very gay story.
Yeah, like everyone wasn't turned on by this Victoria's Secret catalog. Like I just thought that was like a thing that happened to everyone. And they're like, no, like and so it's things like that, or I was watching The Good Place with a friend, and they were talking about how Eleanor's character is super bi. And I'm like, I just never noticed. And so they like paused the show and they pointed out like when she was saying how hot Tahani was. And I was like, well, that's just like a fact. Like that, like not like I feel like that everybody just knows that. And they're like, no, she's bi. She's attracted to women too. And so I think that those moments, like I missed them because I just thought, oh, like even if like I just thought, oh, straight people feel this way too. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I don't know that many straight people, but the ones that I do know inform me that straight people act like straight women don't experience attraction to other women. I know that sounds crazy. And this is such a good, like, I love talking about that kind of thing because this is such a good example of how queerness is inherent to people. Because we were not raised in affirming environments. But that was still there. That was always a part of who you were. Also, Eleanor is incredibly bi. Tahani is so beautiful.
Yes.
And The Good Place is one of the best shows ever. And in this show, it's almost played for laughs because that's often, I think, how bi women, bi femmes, and people around them like don't take them quite as seriously, or they might not even take themselves and those feelings seriously. So we're getting back into erasure. I feel like it's like a cycle, like, oh, by privilege, by erasure, by privilege, by erasure.
Well, and I think, and I kind of also want to name that it's a different experience for men than it is for women, because I think there is this whole thing where it's like, oh, like if a woman said like, yeah, I experimented in college with women, that's kind of normalized, right? And I think when men say that, there's a different acceptance societally to that, like, oh, I experimented with men in college, And so I think there is this whole like almost fetishization of like women, and so it's a totally it's a totally different experience. I do want to name that because I think there is a piece of that makes your experience really nuanced when you come out as bi as a woman.
Yes, thank you for that. There's also the perception, I think, is that all bi women are actually straight and all bi men are actually gay.
Yeah.
Like if you, the way I feel like I've been treated as a bi feminine person has been like, oh, you're a straight girl who thinks that women are beautiful because everybody thinks that women are beautiful. And people that I know who are bi men, it's like, oh, you are a gay man who can't accept yourself. And so it's a double standard that doesn't take anybody at their word when they tell you who they are, and I hate that.
Definitely. And I think too, I wish I would have understood that, because part of me understanding myself was understanding that your attraction to different genders may not be on an equal level. So like knowing that maybe if you, and I think I've said this on an episode I did on Thereafter with Cortland when we talked about our bisexuality, but like knowing that if you line up 10 people, men and women, 5 men, 5 women, you might, your level of attraction may not be 50-50 or whatever it is, and so I like knowing that type of attraction and your type when it comes to women is maybe different than your level of attraction type when it comes to men, or the connectedness that you feel with the person. And there's so many different realities to it that it's not just like a binary, I guess. And so I think there were so many conversations I had about that kind of thing. And then also having discovered my sexuality while I was in a monogamous marriage, knowing like I had people ask me like, have you had experiences with women? And I was like, I don't need that to validate my sexuality, because that's not what bisexuality is about. It's not about an experience.
No, you absolutely don't. Because people know, people who are straight and want to have sex with somebody of a different gender than them, they know that they are straight before they have sex with anyone, right?
Exactly.
People who have not yet had sex know that they are straight. People who have not yet had sex know that they are gay. And bisexual people who have not yet had sex with somebody of a gender that they would hypothetically like to do not need to go have an experience that the person questioning them can mine to get whatever they want out of that conversation in order to be valid as bisexual people.
Yes, 1,000%.
Sorry, I'm sorry, you got me on a little bit of a rant.
No, it's a good rant. It's an absolutely good rant, because we don't ask high school students when they're like wanting to date the opposite gender, like, how do you really know that you're straight unless you've had an experience with the opposite gender?
Right. We don't ask anybody that. I also wanted to say, as far as a spectrum of attraction to genders other than your own, the Kinsey scale actually was really validating for me regarding that.
Yes.
Because you can be somebody who is primarily, in the words of the Kinsey scale, primarily homosexual but more than primarily heterosexual but more than incidentally homosexual. That's a bi person.
Mm-hmm.
What is the Kinsey scale?
Oh, buddy.
I don't know about
Google
these
it.
things.
Go ahead and Google Kinsey scale and I'll explain it to you.
Okay, how do I spell that?
Kinsey. Dr. Alfred Kinsey was an early sexuality researcher who did a lot to normalize non-straight sexual attraction. His work is not bad or wrong. It has been expanded on greatly. There's a lot that he didn't quite get to, but he was a huge part of the foundation of the way that we understand attraction now. So if you pull up an image of the Kinsey scale, you'll see like a zero. It's a scale of 0 to 6. So somebody that is a 0 is only heterosexual, only straight. And somebody who is a 6 is only gay. And then there's that whole 1 to 5. So a 3 is exactly 50-50. And then if you're at a 2, you're mostly into people of a different gender than you, but a little bit into people of the same gender as you. Or if you're like a 5, are you looking at the scale?
Yeah, I've got it right in front of me.
If you're a 5, then you're almost always into people of the same gender as you, but every once in a while, somebody of a different gender just does it for you. It explains people's sexual attraction as something different from like, you're straight, you're gay, or you're exactly 50-50 down the middle bi. Because that's not how a lot of people experience, especially bisexuality. And you can experience different so there's sexual attraction and there's also romantic attraction, right? So I experience, honestly, more sexual attraction to women and feminine people, but I generally experience more romantic attraction to men and masculine people. So that can also get thrown into the mix. It's not binary.
Yes.
So that was kind of a tool that I came across really early in my journey of understanding myself that was really validating and helped me put myself at a place on a scale, even though my place on that scale has moved around multiple times, and I'm sure it will again.
Yeah. And I think that's good to know too, because I think people feel like they need to like mark, okay, like I came out as bi on this day, and then from that day when I was 40 years old to the rest of my life, that's who I am now. And people shift and change, and attractions shift and change. And I've had people that have come out as ace, and then that has changed. And I've had, all different kinds of things. And I think validating, like, it doesn't have to be this, okay, now you're this forever.
Absolutely. And that should always be celebrated when somebody gets to know themselves better.
Yes.
Like, what an amazing, magical thing.
And I'll put an image on the Kinsey of the Kinsey scale on our Instagram for the.
I'm really glad you asked, Gavi, because I just blew past that, because in my head that's something everybody knows about. So I'm really glad that you asked.
Well, that's what we do on this show.
Yeah, usually I'm sharing horrible things about Christian fundamentalism. It's nice to be talking about nice things.
Explain this very basic Christian doctrine to me that everybody would have known if they grew up.
Okay, Megan, but he asks
Christianity.
about that, and he's like, explain atonement.
Yeah, but okay, so true confession, earlier just in this interview, I Googled something you asked me, because I don't use that language of compet that you said.
Oh.
And so I'm so used to saying, like, how did I say it? That we're, heteronormativity, right?
Yeah.
And so that's just kind of how I frame that conversation. And so when I looked it up and it's compulsory heterosexuality, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But I just have never shortened it like that.
I just say compet because I will trip over the word heteronormativity.
Yeah.
If I'm not really thinking about it's just because I know what I pronounce well on mic. That's the only reason.
No, you're good. You're good.
So, so we talked about, understanding of what bisexuality is and having language to describe yourself. And that's a barrier that prevented both of us from coming out to ourselves sooner. Were there other barriers that prevented you from coming out to yourself before you came out to the world?
Oh, for sure. And I think legibility, to, like, knowing that once I make kind of a statement, and I think, well, I guess to myself first, is your question. So I want to focus on that. Because, it's different to be legible to others, but also to kind of have an understanding of, like, what does it mean to be bisexual, and what does that mean when you're in a monogamous, straight passing marriage. And so what we had, there were a lot of conversations that were had around that, and a lot of coming to an understanding of what that was. And so even trying to figure out, and like I said earlier, the imposter syndrome that I had, because I was like, well, I can't be queer because I've had so many friends that have known since they were like 6, or like they've just known all along that, like, this is who I am. And I've also seen, so, like, my queer friends go through so much trauma in the church, and because I was kind of leaving already when I was processing this and coming out, like, I just didn't have this experience of sitting in pews and having my very existence be, talked about the way that it is talked about in such a hateful way. And so I had that process of, like, is this really who I am, or am I allowed to be bi? And it was so helpful to have, like, my podcast co-host Cortland is one of my best friends. He was somebody that I processed a lot of this with, and other queer friends too. And it was so great to have the validation of those conversations, and other kind of creators, and, like I said, authors that kind of process that too. So I think I want to shout out to Paula Stone Williams, who wrote her book on transitioning genders when she was 60 years old, and she had been married for 40 years. And so I was like, okay.
Wait, was she a pastor? Because I think I have seen videos, if so.
Yes, she was a pastor.
I have seen videos of her speaking. She is amazing.
Yeah, so I met her.
And now I want her book.
She's amazing. I met her at Wild Goose last year. She was really, really a great friend to me that weekend. And we had her on thereafter, but she talks a lot about gender and just kind of what it was like to be in the world as a man. And then how transitioning just kind of opened her eyes to what women experience. But just her whole story allowed me to be like, because I kind of thought, well, I'm 40 years old. It's kind of too late, to have, like, a new awakening to something. And I was like, no, she was married for 40 years and was 60 years old when she had her awakening, and it wasn't too late for her. And I was like, this is who I am, and I want to be authentic about who I am.
And I'm so glad that you did that, because it was right in the middle of that process that I found you on Twitter and hit that follow button and wanted to hear more about what you had to say. What do you think was more difficult, coming out to yourself or coming out to the world?
Oh, that's a really good question.
That's kind of a hardball question.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a long process of trying to figure out like who I was and is this me and that kind of thing. But what I didn't want to do was have that process over and over and over again with people that didn't understand, if that makes sense. And so I didn't want to put myself in a situation where I was getting questioned for justification, validation, explanation. And so that's why I chose to come out the way that I did, because I did have people in my life come to me afterwards offended at the way that I came out publicly instead of to them privately first. And so it was, when I get that feedback, my inclination is to really kind of first say like, well, this isn't really about you. and second,
Right.
say like, also, I feel like you're asking the wrong question. Like, instead of kind of, like, why did you come out this way? Like, I think those folks should maybe ask themselves, like, what was it that prevented me from being a safe space to have those conversations with Meghan,
So I want to be really careful how I phrase this, because coming out very publicly all at once, kind of getting everybody in one fell swoop, is more than valid. But I want to share my incredibly different experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I never came out. Like, I never made a Facebook post. I never did anything, or I don't know, had a party. What do people do? I did come out to my parents and my siblings Christmas of 2017, because I had a girlfriend at the time. This was right before I met my husband. I had a girlfriend, and I really thought we were something. I mean, I was shopping for engagement rings while I was in Alabama. And then, of course, she broke my heart, because that's what really pretty girls do. It's okay. That's her right. She's allowed.
You know how people come out, Sadie, is if they get like, the gender reveal cake, but like you cut it open and it's the bi pride flag colors inside.
I might just make that for myself. Megan, do you want some cake? What kind of icing do you
like? I know.
like?
I would love that. But also I was having flashbacks.
I can bake a cake.
Yes. But like, I was thinking like, it's not like baptism, right? Like that's like when the way you said that, like, oh, I didn't do this big thing. And I was thinking like, there's not like this sacrament that you have to do to become part of the queer community. You know what I mean?
Yes.
They dip your head in the water of, I don't know, what's really bisexual drink?
Rosé.
Yeah. I like rosé.
Yes.
I've been drinking,
I don't know, Gavi. Are you sure you don't need to be asking yourself some questions, bud?
I've been drinking pink Prosecco because they had a really good deal on it at the liquor store. So maybe yeah, so they dip your head in pink Prosecco, and they proclaim you in the name of David Bowie and Kristen Stewart.
Yeah. No, so I never, I always felt like when it came down to it, I felt like coming out publicly was it felt like an obligation and felt like a burden. And it sounds like it didn't feel that way for you.
No, and it didn't feel like an obligation, but it was important to me to be who I was, and B, I have a lot, like I said, about legibility. Like, there's a lot of people in my life that really don't understand, and I was okay with that, because I was like, I would rather me be the one queer interaction that they've heard of, and have that kind of nugget of, what happened there, to carry into as the next generation coming is becoming more and more authentic about who they are and their queerness and things like that. And to have like my peer group that are raising kids that are my kids' age, because my kids are 9 and 11 right now, and having them be able to be like, I do know someone that's queer, and I like, it just felt like that was the I wanted there to be a little bit more representation in some folks' lives, and then also to be authentically who I was. And again, that's not for everyone. And I want to validate, like, if you don't have that big, I have to have this coming out moment, like that's a totally valid way to be bisexual.
Yeah, and so is, from the other side, so is having a giant coming out Facebook post, have a party, celebrate and explain and get it all out in one place. I totally support that way as well.
Yeah.
See, I was also, we're talking about something that happened over 6 years ago. So I was also 24 when what I did was I did come out to my family because I really thought it was going to be something with this particular girl. And that was the only coming out conversation I ever had. And then after that Christmas, I just started living as a bi person and posting bi flags during Pride Month and dating people. And then I pretty quickly met my husband and got into a monogamous relationship with him. But I just kind of never quit talking about it. I think I mentioned being bi in like the first episode of this podcast, but I just never had a big coming out thing again. And I thought to myself, well, maybe I have to make a Facebook post and deal with the ire of the people from my church growing up.
Yeah, no, who wants to do that? No.
Like, maybe I have to like earn my queerness, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, no.
By dealing with this dealing with this anger, dealing with this hatred and taking it. Because just a lot like you, I grew up in a very homophobic, non-affirming place, but I would hear preaching about how terrible this or that group of people are, but I never internalized it because I did not know yet that who they were describing was me. So I felt like I hadn't earned my queerness by experiencing hatred or anger from other people. And I felt that I was obligated to make a public coming out statement so that I could get that anger response or get that I'm so disappointed in you response. And that would kind of be my christening into the gay community, if we're going back with the into the LGBT community, if we're going with the baptism analogy.
Yeah.
And I eventually realized that like that's not what makes me a bi person. Being bi is what makes me a bi person.
Yes.
I love talking about kind of this area of coming out, especially coming out as a bi person, because I think it gives us such a good opportunity to validate other people and to remind people that there is no such thing as the wrong time, as too late, or a bad reason to come out. There's no bad reason to come out or to delay coming out, right?
Yeah. And also, to be fair to kind of what you just spoke to, I did not make a Facebook post. I came out in my own house on Twitter and screenshot that to Instagram, which is adjacent to my house. And then that trickled over to Facebook. And most of the reception that I got was, like I said, queer folks that were wonderfully embracing and accepting. And the few folks that had questions or problems with it had seen it come up on Facebook. Through my, Pursuing Life, like Facebook professional page. That's just like it's just when you check the box that Instagram copies over to Facebook. So,
right.
There were ways that I wasn't, I did avoid the old like church youth group, and all of that. But I will say, when it comes to validating, there were a lot of people that are not out still, even that were in my DMs saying, hey, thank you for this, because I see myself in your post and I'm not out for this, and this reason, or I'm not out even to my family, or even to my husband, or even to my kids, or at work. And I think, like you said, being out in public is not what makes you queer. It's being queer that makes you queer. And
Mhm.
so I think that's absolutely valid to have, for whatever that reason is, I'm not out, and that's super valid. That's you and that's your journey.
And something that a person is doing to keep themselves safe at their job, in their family, in a church that, when they're in a faith transition, whatever, that is okay. And you don't get to a point in life where it's too late to come out if coming out is something that's important to you.
Yes.
Let's go take up the offering. And when we come back, I'm really excited to continue this conversation.
Sounds good.
Hey, Sadie here. If this is your first time listening to the Leaving Eden podcast, make sure you go back and check out episode 57. It's a primer episode for new listeners. That episode tells my personal story and gives you all the terms and information that you'll need to know going forward. Also, check out our cult true crime series, The First Family of Fundamentalism, so that you can get the whole cult story. If you like our show, you can support us by joining our Patreon, where we have extended and uncensored episodes as well as other bonus content available. You can also join in the discussion in our Facebook group. That group is called Eden Exodus. Tell a friend, tell a family member, tell your worst enemy. The Leaving Eden podcast is a fully independent podcast, and we really appreciate your support. Now, back to the show.
We're talking about bisexual pride. Sadie and Megan are talking about bisexual pride. I'm mostly just here.
You are being an ally and learning stuff today.
I'm learning quite a lot today. I learned about the Kinsey scale. I learned about the Kinsey scale today, which I didn't know about before. So I feel really great about that. Yeah.
I know, Megan, I want to talk a little bit more about like the theological side of this. Was any facet of your own queerness a catalyst for deconstructing, or did it kind of go the other way around? Like you deconstructed first and then started to find out about your queerness?
Yeah, it's funny because I think that I had a tweet, something to the effect of like the pipeline of becoming queer affirming to becoming queer is very real, like the evangelical pipeline. And I had a lot of folks that were like, oh, that was me. And then I had a lot of folks that were like, actually, my journey was the opposite. Like I was queer and then I was queer affirming, which is very valid because that happens to so many folks that grow up in the church. And I think for me specifically, I was deconstructing first and I became queer affirming. And a lot of that, queer affirmation came from watching a sermon series that I was going to this local church at the time, and they were doing this series on race, and it was actually a really well done series in some regards, and in others it wasn't. But what happened was in that series they kind of took Black Lives Matter and they were like, this is the part of Black Lives Matter that we are on board with, and then the part where they disrupted nuclear family structure we're not on board with. And so I went down a rabbit hole and I found a series that pastor had preached at a different church about homosexuality. And that was the first time it had been laid out to me that if you're queer in the church, you have three options. You can be celibate for life. You can force yourself into a heterosexual marriage, and they kind of said, if you choose to live into your queer identity, then you're just not living what God's plan for you was.
Oh,
and I just, at the time was like, okay, so I went through purity culture, like wait until you're married to have sex. And the thought of being told like, no, actually, sex just isn't something that you get to have in life. Sorry, you just drew a different card in life. And I was like, I could almost sense the trauma just being handed to folks sitting there listening to that and being like, okay, this is me that you're talking about. And so these are the rules that I'm given. And like I said before, I was a rules person. Like, give me the rules and I'll follow them. And I could just feel like there are people trying to follow these rules as if these rules are correct, and that is not okay, And so that's when everything started to shake up and shake upside down for me. So that was first, before I even knew my own queerness.
So the topic of queerness was a thing that helped you deconstruct, even though it wasn't your own. That's fascinating.
1,000%. Yeah. And it was, even some of the resources that kind of got me into queer affirmation, I don't think are affirming enough anymore. You know what I mean? So
growth.
Like there was a book that I read that was like, here's how you can be gay and Christian, and it was a lot of like respectability politics of like, as long as you're monogamous and you wait until you're married to have sex and you can be just like the straights, then like you can still be okay, we'll allow it. And I was like, okay, there needs to be like an expansive understanding of queerness, because they're still trying to create binaries there that just should not be there.
Yeah, that is tough.
And it also seems to me like, in order for them to understand it, or I guess be on board with it, they have to feel like it's within the framework of what they're already saying. They're like, okay, we can get on board with this thing as long as it's still within what we say that you have to do.
Yes, 1,000%. And that I got to that point. That's a really great point, because I got to the point where I was like, some of this stuff that is, especially in the particular resource that I was reading, like I wasn't quite sure about the argument that they were making about like how the theology works. But I got to a point where I was like, I don't even care if I can make the theology make sense or not, because it's more important to me to see and love and be inclusive to people than it is to try to make sense of this within a theological framework. And so my ethics and my values are not based on the Bible. And I've had people say what are they based on then? Like how can you possibly be a moral person and not have ethics based on the Bible? But I feel very rooted in harm reduction and human flourishing. And I feel like that's taken me way farther in the sense of loving people than I ever went when I was an evangelical.
I had just talked about this on our show a couple weeks ago about moral development not necessarily needing to come from the Bible, even for people who are believers.
Yeah.
Like you can absolutely use the Bible as a great source for moral development if that is one of your sources. But you can even, if you want to, you can even mix it up a little bit. You can get some of your beliefs about morals from the Bible and others from reasoning or expounding on scripture. It's really interesting how being an ally came first, because that's kind of similar to my experience. And it was more of a spiral / kind of all happened at once thing. But that was not too dissimilar from my experience. I know you've spoken on thereafter about whether identifying as a Christian still feels right to you. And I know from my own experience that can be a long process, and I don't want to grill you like, where exactly are you in your process? Because that's mean. But what I do want to ask, at the place where you currently are in your own deconstructing process, what do you need from like progressive and affirming Christians? Like, what do you need to see from people who are firmly Christian but want to be progressive and fully affirming?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things in there. First of all, I don't feel like it's a grilling at all to talk about where I'm at with my faith, but I will say this: progressive Christianity held a lot of space for me when I was deconstructing, and I needed that. I needed the sense that if I still wanted to hold on to some sense of Christianity, I could. And if I wanted to let it go, I could. And I felt like progressive Christianity sat there with all of it. And there were times where I pushed back on good friends of mine that tweeted generalizations about progressive Christians, where I was like, hey, like I don't see myself in this tweet, and I see myself as a progressive Christian. And they were like, absolutely 1,000%. And we had conversations about that, you know. And I was going to a progressive church for a little bit, and then it was like I stopped needing it, you know. And it was like I got to a point where it didn't become important to me anymore to be able to say with like, you know, certainty, like, oh, I'm still a Christian. It wasn't scary to me to say I'm not really even sure what I believe. And so I made a statement recently about like just changing my bio from progressive Christian to agnostic. And I was kind of like, you know, I've had conversations with folks where it's like, if you say you're not agnostic, I don't know how honest you're being, because who has the level of certainty that you would need to not have some level of agnosticism, you know? So
yeah, fundamentalists, that's who.
Yeah.
Not to generalize, but a lot of people who have like that kind of I know that I know that I know.
And I think you can generalize certain, you can and that's why like when I tweet about evangelicals, I'm pretty specific to say evangelicals and not Christians, and so and even within that, I've had evangelicals reach out and say like, well, that's not me, and I'm like, okay, but when I say evangelicals, I'm talking about this, this, and this, and they're like, okay, well, that is me, and so I do think that there are certain things that are by definition evangelical that you can critique about evangelicals. But on the other side of your question, which was about what we need, actually say it again, if you don't mind.
So at the place where you currently are, what do you need to see from people who are firmly Christian, progressive Christians, and want to be affirming? I guess I'm asking, like, as somebody who is queer and as somebody who is still in faith transition.
Yeah, and I can answer that as someone that I'm going to fully confess and fully admit that sometimes I struggle with people. Like I guess Cortland and I on the podcast have a good balance of like, I don't have a lot of patience for folks that aren't fully affirming, and he like is able to make more nuance. And I've even had private conversations about this, where if there's an asterisk next to your affirmation, then I'm not here for that, And so I think when it comes to like what's necessary, I think sit down and listen. And I don't know if I did enough of that as an ally, I will tell you, but I see a lot of folks like on Twitter that I say even are great allies, but are almost platforming themselves on as straight men, straight cis white men, and I say it because I see more men do it than I see women, but platforming themselves on queer affirmation. And it's kind of like getting into this territory of like, that's so great that you're an ally. Is this benefiting you more than it's benefiting the folks that you're trying to be an ally for and show up for? Because it feels like in some cases it can be. And so it's like, what are your what's the incentive that you have to be inclusive? Is it because you're trying to like grow your platform, grow your church, grow your following? It's like, or is it because you really see and love queer people? Because I think that's a distinction. And I think not everybody has sat with that thought and that mentality. And that's just getting into progressive spaces. I mean, if you're not fully inclusive and affirming, then you're not even at this conversation, at the table having this conversation. You know what I mean?
And I want, because I am in a slightly different, but not that different place with faith, and still kind of finding my way, but I could see my end game being fully affirming progressive Christian. That's one of several places that I could definitely see myself ending up. And, I want to know how to truly build bridges with people who are atheist or agnostic or in a more hazy area of belief. Because if that is the path that my spirituality ends up taking, which that's the direction I'm heading right now, I want to have actual connection with people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that also comes from just embracing and accepting fully the person, fully who they are without stipulation. And I think that means like I was at a progressive church that had a panel about deconstructing faith. And on that panel were people that were atheists, people that were agnostic. And a lot of churches would have been like, you can only be up on stage if you still believe in this XYZ God, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think validating, you can be queer and be a Christian. You can be queer and not be a Christian. You can be queer and be whoever you are. And I'm still going to sit at the table with you. And there's no requirement. There's no like, oh, you have to be this kind of queer or this way of being in the world in order for you to come into my space or share space with me or for me to hold space for you or whatever it is. Like, I think that really, that's how connection and relationship happen when there's no requirement. You can, and that isn't even about queerness. You can be a hot mess and I'll show up for you,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like so much of of where I've ended up in this like online space, talking deconstruction, talking my own experience, has necessitated building bridges with people who are in a little bit different place than I am. Like one of my really good friends in the online deconstruction content creation space is an atheist, and that is not going to change. That is what he believes and who he is. My podcast co-host is Jewish and sees everything outside this kind of Christian hegemony that we're so used to.
That's me.
Yes. Hi, Gavi. You're still here.
I love that. I adore that.
And so, like, every conversation we have on our podcast necessitates that kind of like cross, like a bridge across to different religious beliefs. And I do not get to be that Christian person anymore who's like, well, you know, actually Christianity came from Judaism, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't get to do that anymore. I have had to grow out of that real quick.
The other thing that I think about is that when I don't understand something and you have to explain it to me, or when we have a conversation where we have to go in depth about a concept like that, when you're like completely outside of it, then the person who's explaining it to you has to like low-key deconstruct that concept for themselves in order to be able to explain it to you. And I think that's for me, there have been times when I've had to do that, and that I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but I can't think of one. But I know that's
you know what episode hit me really hard for that one?
Which one?
It's a very, very early episode. Is Don't You Dare Have a Christian Seder.
Right.
Because all of a sudden, Megan, I'm having to explain to my friend who is not a Christian and who is Jewish about the Lamb of God and atonement and all of these things and like prophecies in scripture. And I'm like, oh, none of the way that I'm explaining this is remotely culturally sensitive. The way that I'm explaining this is very much like my way is the right way. And I am going to have to take all of that apart and figure it out. And I'm going to actually have to have a conversation about this. But I value that so much. And I value the opportunity to do that so much. And that's really what I'm going to get into like Christianese. That's where my heart is. For people who are in this deconstruction space who are believers or not sure, and who are affirming allies or queer, I think there is something that all of us can make together, but it depends on our ability to have those conversations.
I was just going to say, I think that those conversations are important. And like I said, like the first book that I read about, theology and queer theology is a resource that I not only don't recommend anymore, but I push back on their Instagram posts because they've, taken some of the stances that they've taken. But do I think that their resource should be like stripped from shelves if it helps people that are early on in their journey? No, right? But I struggle with that, right? Because I have a hard time with some of those conversations that need to happen in the early stages. And maybe it's because I see myself in those and I know how fiercely ignorant I used to be and how much work it took to get. And so you would think that would make me even more, I guess, empathetic, but it's hard. It's almost harder for me. And I remember seeing a progressive author that I push back on because she writes about sexuality in a way that I disagree with. A progressive author kind of have this post about, I won't say her name because the last time I critiqued her on a podcast, the podcast got a 1-star review because progressives hate it when I get mad. I'll tell you after we wrap. But when I get mad about her, but she had this post that was like, if I'm on a spectrum of like A, B, C, D, and E, and I'm trying to move from point A to point E, I need people to help me go from like point A to point C before I can get all the way to E. And it's like, I got what she was saying, but she's also non-affirming. And so I was like, that's a lot of letters to say without saying LGBTQ, like it was just like, and so I get it.
Are you trying to get to E?
Exactly.
Or are you trying to get to C and give yourself a round of applause for how far you've come?
Exactly. And recognize the privilege that you can just like take your time, slowly getting from point A to point B to point B while they're like legislating to make people's existence illegal. It's like recognize the privilege that you have, just kind of idling away in this. So yeah, I do get ranty about it, and I have probably areas of growth that I need for that kind of level of like, it's okay to like we can have some of those beginner conversations, and but it is hard.
See, is it okay? I want to push back on like your statement of I need to grow and be more ready to have those beginner conversations. And I'm actually going to use scripture to do it, so please don't hate me. But like, this is
Wow.
this is a concept that you are absolutely familiar with, is the concept of spiritual gifts, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
And I don't know, did
I don't
somebody
know
ever
what
tell
spiritual
you?
gifts, Sadie. What spiritual gifts?
It's in the sequels, Gavi.
I'm putting on my seatbelt.
You mean the fan fiction?
Yes, Gavi. It's in the fan fiction. That's what he calls the New Testament, Megan. This is also by Apostle Paul, who is your favorite, Gavi.
Oh, you mean the guy who like murdered a bunch of people and then said, "I changed my mind. I'm not going to murder people anymore. Please believe me that I'm a good guy now."
Yeah, Megan, I'm going to find the episode where I explained the Apostle Paul and send it to you. It is comedy gold.
Yes.
Because he had no idea. He had never heard of the guy. So this.
Oh wait, can we just? That's great. Somebody growing up without ever hearing about the Apostle Paul. That's a great existence.
I'd heard of the guy.
I
just didn't like pay attention. Like no, literally, whenever anybody who is like is talking about like, Matthew said this, I'm like, cool, like Matthew.
But
Paul,
you
Luke,
you had a concept of like what the Gospels are and like what Revelation is, but he didn't really have any idea what went between the Gospels and Revelation.
No, basically it's it's like a bunch of people say stuff about Jesus. They say this is what happened to Jesus, and then Revelation has dragons and the apocalypse, and that's
and there's like 2/3 of the New Testament is in between those two things, and you had no idea what was in there.
Yeah, and then somehow the Palpatine returned with secrets only the Sith knew, and they don't explain any of it.
That's in the Apocrypha, actually. Niche Christian joke. So, okay, Gavi, spiritual gifts. Do you know about the fruits of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance.
Yes.
Gavi, heard of this?
What's this?
So the idea is that Christians are impacted by the Holy Spirit, and they will show these character traits when they are in tune with the Holy Spirit.
Oh, like Bill Gothard.
Yes.
Or Donald Trump.
Right. Famous example of all the fruits of the Spirit. But there's also this idea of spiritual gifts. So when the Holy Spirit is active in your life, you will get, it's almost like Christian superpowers, but they're very boring superpowers. One of them is discernment. So basically wisdom about making decisions in situations and like understanding what other people are up to. One of the spiritual gifts is teaching. So you, like, the Holy Spirit makes you a better teacher, a better explainer of things to other people. Megan, do you remember, like, did somebody ever tell you what your spiritual gift was?
1,000%. Are we going there right now?
Oh yeah, like, what's your spiritual gift? I gotta know.
So I need a little bit of an explanation, but it won't take very long. I had this whole bit where I prayed for like an hour a day for a few years, and it was just kind of like I wanted to be able to tell people, like, if they asked me to pray for them, I wanted to be able to say, like, I will, and really follow through. Kind of like when you go to the dentist and they're like, do you floss your teeth? And you're like, yeah, I actually do. Like, I really do, you know? And so that's just the brain that I have. And so when I did the inventories, my gifts were faith and intercession. Intercession because I actually prayed, but then also faith because I would, like, people would tell me what was going on with their lives, and I would, like, ask them how things were going. When things went well, I believed that was God doing that because I had prayed for them. You know what I mean? So then I had this, like, weird faith where you know.
So yeah. So I'm a discernment girly, and there is absolutely a discernment to witchy pipeline. That is the deconstruction pipeline that nobody seems to talk about.
Okay, wait. So discernment, is that like a +2, +4 if you like roll a d20
Yes, it's Holy Spirit mind reading.
Okay, so
Christian
it's
superpower. Yes.
roll for discernment, and then it's like +4.
Right, which means basically trauma response is the other way to say that. So Megan, back to, you were talking about, I promise this is going somewhere. You were talking about like, oh, I think I need to have more patience for people who are early in the process of becoming affirming.
Yes.
What if that's just not your role? Because I am, not to toot my own horn, I'm really good at that. I have the capacity to sit down and have a 3-hour conversation and not expect that person to get from point A to point E, but be fully satisfied and happy that I was able to get them from point A to point B. And maybe on the next 3-hour conversation, I'll get them to B.5 or C. That fulfills me. That kind of slowly processing somebody through and helping to get them to closer to E, and being able to really accept that they may not end up at E, and to feel proud of the connection that we built in getting them from A to C, that fills my soul. That truly lifts me up. So if it doesn't do that for you, maybe that's just not your role, because I think the world needs people like me, which I think is what you were speaking to. Like, somebody needs to do that, but maybe that doesn't have to be all of us, because I think the world also needs people who are like, hey, anything less than fully affirming is not acceptable to me. And I think those two kind of balance out.
So I see what you're saying, and I think that I've sat in that space before. But I'm going to tell you something this is good conversation, because I think that it really depends on your approach then to those conversations. Because if I come out of the gate just writing somebody off for not being affirming, and there are times, believe me, when I've like sent a text to someone like, hey, what do you think if I reply to this tweet this way? Like, there was a pastor that was complaining that he got kicked out of his denomination for not being affirming. And it was like, there's so many
Sucks
pastors
to suck.
I know, like it was like, oh, you're feeling excluded, I'm sorry. Like, and I just wanted to be like, hey, like the day that he's tweeting this, like, have you ever thought about like just being affirming, like just things like that, where I just want to like kind of taunt them. And they're like, also, like, let's give him a second to process that he just like lost his job and like all these things. But I'm like, I maybe I can give him like a second, but like, you know what I'm saying? If you come out of the gate and you're hating on people, here's what has the potential to happen. On the flip side, I have a really somebody that I love dearly on Twitter that is documenting their trans journey, and they came into my DMs when they were not out, they were not affirming yet. So it was well before they were transgender and well before they were affirming. And they sent me some of their blog posts on some spiritual abuse that they experienced. And I was like, I knew they weren't affirming, but I had also seen in their writing, like, wow, you experienced some like really legit trauma, and I am so sorry, and like, wow. And they recently reached out to me because it's Pride Month, and they're being very like, putting all kinds of like beautiful Pride posts about their now transgender journey. And they were like, that moment that you, with the platform that you have and the person that you are, validated what I was going through, helped me not only become affirming, but helped me affirm my own self, and then helped me come out. And I'm like, wow, what if I had handled that so much differently? What if I had just written them off and been like, F you, you're not affirming, And so it's like, I also recognize, like, yes, I think you're right, Sadie. Like, maybe some conversations are just not for me, but I also think the way that we navigate how we're not going to have those conversations is equally important to the way that we navigate how we do have those conversations.
I think we're so on the same page here, because honestly, sometimes F you, you're not affirming is a completely appropriate response.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes that is the correct response, but sometimes it's not. And I think we can talk about that. I think we can find ways to better navigate that. So so when we get in those situations where the correct response is F you, we can fully enjoy it. And all of the other conversations we can navigate and help people figure it out.
The other thing that I was thinking about with regards to this is that, and this is just a personal observation, is that often I find that Christians may have a harder time thinking outside of binaries and becoming affirming of people uh, who are not on a gender binary, because much of their theology and much of their life is based around binaries. You know, are you saved? Are you unsaved? Are you going to heaven? Are you going to hell? Are you baptized? Are you not baptized? Like it's a thing that happens to you and that changes you to something else. And you're either this or you're that. Do you take this role in the church or do you take this role in the church? You can be this thing. You can be this thing. You can be this thing specifically. I think that this is especially true with evangelical Protestants. A lot of times can have a harder time because their entire conception of the life is, this is who I am, this is what my role is because of who I am. And if you see somebody who is like, well, my existence is outside of your conception of what a person is, then that can be difficult for them to sort of comprehend. And if you can't comprehend it, how can you really affirm it?
Yep.
And that's a thing I think that allies can do, and queer people that have a lot of privilege can do, is help people. Maybe we don't challenge the binary of are you affirming or not affirming, and instead we challenge the idea that things are always binary. And digging into that with people, I think that's something that I really try to do. That's something that so much of my online work is related to.
To that point, I think that it's all about like people not understanding something and being afraid of the thing that they don't understand too. Instead of like, let me listen and understand your lived experience and your experience. It's like, hold on, let me check with my pastor and see what the rule is and whether I'm supposed to like you or not.
Yes. So we have a pretty diverse audience, and I would be willing to bet that we have some audience members who are thinking about all of these things and maybe this is a funny way to put it, but considering becoming affirming. And I hope that way of phrasing it will make sense to you, because that has been both of us at some point in our life. Like, I think I might be becoming an affirming Christian, and like, what does that mean? If you were speaking to our audience members who are in that space, what advice would you give them, or how can you give us your thoughts on how they can navigate that process with the most kindness and compassion possible?
It's so interesting because I think just that phrase, considering becoming affirming, is loaded, right? Because
that's a funny phrase, but like, I've been there, so I know it's real.
Yeah, but when I hear that, I think like considering like loving and validating someone's existence or not, and so I think if folks are thinking through that and that's kind of how they're approaching it, because for me, I feel like I thought that I loved queer people and that was my desire, but I realized as an evangelical that I did not love them well, and that I had to unpack why, and I had to unpack how to love folks well. And this was before I knew I was queer, right? And so when it was, because I sat in evangelical spaces for decades before I ever heard that 3-point sermon series, and so once I realized like, this is how the church thinks that they're loving queer folks, this is what it means to say love the sinner, hate the sin. Hell no. Like, I was like immediately like, what needs to happen that I can figure out how to love people, really love people, not this love. And so I think that when you say you love queer people and you're not affirming in the sense of, and I think if people don't understand that language, it means like you think that what their life is a sin or their existence is a sin or who they are is a sin. I think you need to think about what that looks like, because it looks like, I think somebody on Twitter phrased it as like hate with a love mask on, because you're like, you really are, they're not in a safe space if the people that they're with think that who they are is an abomination. And so if you're on that journey and you're processing, I would say do that with your straight friends. Do that in spaces where you're not going to expose your queer friends to that, unless you have queer friends that have signed up for that. Like you said, Sadie, like you're
Like
like,
me,
I will,
yes,
I will do that
exactly.
work. I will sit with someone I don't feel, like activated or triggered by those conversations, then go do that, but like if they're just trying to like call up their queer friends and say like help me process this. I've had that with people who think women shouldn't preach, and people trying to process that with me and get really offended that I don't see their side of things. And I'm like, you're choosing your theology over women. So I can't like, and I'm a woman, so I can't, we're like, you don't recognize the power dynamic here and the privilege dynamic. And so if people aren't able to recognize those power and privilege dynamics, then that's like, deconstruct that first, man. And so like I think that's pretty loaded, but I think that's kind of the advice that I would give is like, do your process without harming queer folks in the process, if that makes sense.
Yes, I love that. And I grabbed a quote, actually wrote this down while you were speaking. What needs to happen so that I can love queer people, really love them?
Yeah.
That's it. It's what do I need to work through to get as close to perfect love as I can?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. I love that. That's exactly, you said that better than I could, which is what I was hoping for asking you that question. Well, I think that's a great note to wrap up our interview on. So we will have some book recommendations, resource recommendations from Meghan in the show notes for our podcast on our Instagram post. We'll blast those out in all the places that we send things out. Meghan, what are your social media accounts? Where can people follow you to hear more from you?
Yeah, thanks. I'm at The Pursuing Life on Twitter mostly, sometimes Instagram, rarely Facebook. And then I'm the co-host of the Thereafter podcast. And so that's on all the socials as well. And I have that in my bio. So yeah.
I've really enjoyed Thereafter. This is more of your style of conversation than what we normally do here. And so I wanted to bring that to our audience because I've been enjoying your show so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meghan, for joining us and for having this really deep conversation. I was just so hoping that this was the kind of conversation we would have. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been fun.
So I hope you all enjoyed our interview with Meghan as much as I enjoyed being in the studio. I have one additional Pride story to read you before we wrap up, and I picked this one because it's got a lot of similarities to Meghan's story. This is from Shannon. She says, "Hey G&S, my name is Shannon, she, her pronouns, and I live in Oklahoma. I grew up Southern Baptist with a lot of IFB family, so I felt very comfortable and familiar with Sadie's stories about growing up, and I experienced many similar things. I attended Cedarville University and graduated with a degree that included a mandatory Bible minor. Christianity was always such a huge part of my personality and dictated all my decisions and almost every aspect of my daily life. Even though I had a few experiences playing house with other girls growing up where I always played the man, I never allowed myself to engage with that part of me. I knew I secretly was interested in how beautiful some women were, but I just thought everyone appreciated the beauty in everyone else. I've been with my husband, who has always been a huge supporter of me in every way, for 12 years, and he's made many comments about how he knows I like women, and when I have a few drinks, I always get more comfortable enough to talk about it, but then can't face it in the light of day. Fast forward to finding your podcast a few months ago. I devoured the first 30 episodes and have kept listening at a rapid pace. I listened and slowly those walls started getting cracks. Is the Bible inerrant? Is my view of morality just black and white? Where do LGBTQ plus people fit into God's plan? You've helped me look at those questions, and it slowly deconstructed what I always thought I knew. This past week was the first time I said it out loud. I told a friend that I think I'm bisexual. I cried afterwards.
Congratulations.
Yes, congratulations.
Wow.
Not on figuring out something about yourself. I never thought those words would come out of my mouth. My husband is very encouraging of me to explore this side of myself, and he's so happy I'm finally trying to embrace who I am. It sounds cliche, but I really owe it to this podcast. You've helped me break down the walls and finally see, and most importantly, accept myself for who I've always been, but never thought I was allowed to be. I could do this. I'm taking my kids to our OKC Pride Month parade this year. They will grow up knowing it's okay to be whoever they are. Thank you, Shannon.
Hell yeah. Oh my God, that was great. And also,
I was under no illusion that I could read that entire thing without crying.
man, that thank you so much for writing that in. Also, big thumbs up to Shannon's husband for
He's got
being
bi-wife energy.
Bi-wife energy. I dig it. It's a positive attribute, and it's good to surround yourself with people who accept you and love you for who you are, not in spite of who you are, or not, or don't see aspects of your personality as drawbacks.
Yeah.
And aspects of your identity.
There are a lot. We talk so much about the ways to integrate faith and queerness or faith and homophobia that we think are bad. But there are lots of ways to integrate faith and queerness that are good. And it sounds like Shannon is on that journey. And a lot of what I want to do is show people options. Like, here are questions to ask yourself. Here are ways to think about this that might help you come to your own conclusions that are hopefully kind and loving. And that starts with accepting and being kind to and loving yourself.
I'm really feeling a positive about acceptance right now, because just like on the day we're recording this, like a few hours ago, I finished editing our interview with Pastor Noah, and that just so good.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for listening, and thank you, Shannon, for writing in, and thank you everybody who's been writing us stories. We're gonna deliver a few more next week when we have our Leaving Eden drag brunch with Dinah Housefire. Make sure you check out the rest of our Pride content. We had an episode a couple weeks ago about the Westboro Baptist Church. A week ago, we had an episode with Pastor Noah Hepler from the Evangelical Lutheran Church of the Atonement. He is an openly gay pastor. He was featured on an episode of Queer Eye, and we talked about affirming theology, and we talked about being on reality TV, which was a lot of fun. And make sure that you guys check out our Shiny Happy People documentary review with Lindsay Williams and Chad Harris, who were nice enough to come on the show with us. You know Lindsay Williams from Cult Chronicles. She's got an Instagram and a TikTok accounts that are both pretty popular. And you know Chad Harris, he's popular on TikTok. You may know him as Arch Radish. They were both featured in the documentary. So you make sure that you want to tune in for those, because we had a great time and a great discussion about those. If you like our show, if you're a fan of our show, make sure that you follow us on social media on TikTok and Facebook and Instagram at Leaving Eden Podcast. Make sure that you join our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/Eden Exodus, and our subreddit, reddit.com/r/Eden Exodus. Sadie, do you want to plug your socials?
Sure, you can follow me on Instagram at Sadie Carpenter Music, on Twitter at Hell Yes Sadie, and on TikTok at Sadie Carpenter 1.
And the only social media I'm really using these days is Instagram, which is at GAVRIELHACOHEN. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
But